All right, we need to talk about Steel Seraph and why you should or should not play it in the current standard metagame, at least on MTG Arena. So, for the most part, Steel Seraph is essentially just a very strong pressure tool that can give your other creatures additional abilities to guarantee extra damage face, for example, by giving flying to something else, or giving yourself an extra blocker by giving something vigilance, or widening the health total gap by giving something lifelink. Now, obviously, the main appeal of the card is that you can cost it for its prototype cost, which will be 1 colorless and 2 white, and you get a 3/3 with the same ability. Additionally, this card has fairly good resistance to certain removal spells in the current standard format, certain removal spells that are being used. So off the top of my head, Go for the Throat, obviously cannot kill artifacts. So you got that. Destroy Evil, this doesn't have 4 toughness. If you cast it for 3, now obviously for 6 it's still vulnerable, but at least it's not vulnerable for 3. Then we have Wandering Emperor, which if you're smart and you know your opponent is playing Wandering Emperor, you will give Steel Seraph Vigilance or give other creatures Vigilance so they can also dodge Wandering Emperor if you're not attacking with Steel Seraph. So, main drawback is that the 3-drops in Standard currently, especially in white, are extremely powerful. So if you have another 3-drop in your hand, you will be casting the other 3-drop. That's what I've realized after playing this card a lot of times and having it in hand on 3 and having other spells that I just always rather cast because you know you can fall back on that 6 mana cost to get a more powerful version of that creature, right? Even with 4 copies of Giada, I was not casting Steel Seraph on 3 when I had a Wedding Announcement or a Fable of the Mirror Breaker, simply because you know you can fall back on that 6 mana cost. And these 2 specific spells that are more powerful on 3, I would say, on average, because they're not vulnerable to a specific targeted removal spell. These spells need to come down as early as possible because they have effects that need a certain amount of turns to resolve, right? So for Fable, you want Chapter 3 to come down as early as possible, and you also want the Goblin Shaman to create that treasure as early as possible. And for Wedding Announcement, you want the Anthem as quickly as possible. So in both cases, it's more beneficial to cast a card that needs multiple turns to set up than to cast a card that you can potentially cast later on for an additional bonus. So essentially, it all boils down to the additional value that you're getting. Now, in some very rare cases where you know your opponent does not have a removal spell in hand, and you feel like you have a very aggressive hand, or in the case where you're not playing Wedding Announcements and you're playing something like an Inspiring Overseer with the Giada package. I'm just using this deck as an example to illustrate my the card's strength and weaknesses. But in that situation, where you can make a read on your opponent not having a removal spell, it could be beneficial to start pushing for damage, since for the most part you're playing 4 Archangel of Wrath, and these can really finish off your opponent quickly. But that's a pretty narrow scenario, since most decks are playing a lot of removal spells, so most likely this will die. But again, as I mentioned prior, it does dodge Go for the Throat, so in the situation where your opponent is not respecting Steel Seraph, you could get away with swinging for a lot of damage early on. But that is difficult to know on Arena without open deck lists. So you're usually better off just casting Wedding Announcement or Fable if you have them. Now, obviously, if you don't have them, then you can cast this as a 3-drop, and it's pretty much all benefit, right? It's all upside. So that's where the real flexibility kicks in, is when you have no alternative and you really need that 3-drop. That's when this card truly shines. And obviously, for 6 mana, it is quite strong, since at that point, for the most part, your opponent will have exhausted a few removal spells, and if this sticks, it can take over the game. Now, here's the problem with Standard, is that Standard is slowly shifting in a direction that actually goes against Steel Seraph's main strengths, which is the fact that it is an artifact, in this case, because it dodges this, right? But that actually has a major downside, is that there's mono-white control that's gaining a lot of popularity, and Grixis is starting to respect the card or artifacts in general by playing cards like Soul Transfer and actually going back to some copies of Infernal Grasp. Not to mention that Steel Seraph also dies to Brotherhood's End, which is a little bit yikes. in some scenarios where you're also playing Bankbuster, like in my case, right? Like I can play Bankbuster, Steel Seraph, and then they play Brotherhoods and destroy all artifacts, and I lose my Steel Seraph and my Bankbuster. And post board potentially, unlicensed first and stuff like that, etc. Or even a blood token. But either way, that's not really the main point. The main problem is this card right here that is gaining an extremely high amount of popularity. And I'm starting to really, really like the card myself, so I am hopping on that train right away. Now, Loran is insane, actually. This is a format in Standard that is pretty much dominated by strong non-creature permanents that also generate creatures. So, I mean, kind of indirectly with Bankbuster, but this is also a vehicle, so obviously you do have that creature side of it that can come in clutch. But obviously, the draw 3 cards is the main selling point, I would say. Then you have Wedding Announcement, obviously. You have Fable. I'm trying to think of other things. And then, exactly, you have Steel Seraph. You have the Flesh Gorger, the black prototype Mythic. And yeah, that's pretty brutal. So Loran is honestly maybe even playable main deck. I'm not here to discuss the specific build of the deck. I'm here to discuss this card specifically. So Mono White is playing Loran main deck, which enters the battlefield, destroys up to one target artifact or enchantment, and then they are also getting a 2/1 Vigilance that can draw a card for yourself. Or no, it can draw a card for both players in the game, essentially, is what I mean. So this card is extremely strong. The card advantage, well, it's not really card advantage. Well, it is because it destroys something and you get a creature. But I'm talking about the both players draw a card. That's not card advantage, but it always benefits, for the most part. It always benefits the deck that is playing Loran. Because if you're playing it, you're the one who's in control of when you want to draw and when you want to potentially let your opponent draw. And you can use it during their end step, right? So you can wait until they pass their turn, and at their end step, before it passes to you, you activate it, and then you draw a card. So essentially, you're drawing 2 cards on your upkeep, but they are potentially tapped out and they can't use that card that they just drew. So it's definitely beneficial for you. And not only that, usually decks with Loran included also have a ton of removal spells, so they can leverage your opponent drawing a random creature for the most part, but it could get a little risky against Grixis because there's counter spells involved, but you don't really activate against Grixis. I'm talking about in general, like a regular mid-range creature matchup, like the mirror match, for example. Either way, this is a big hit for Loran, and it can be so devastating that you just simply lose the game off of that. It's happened to me before. I've done it to my opponents as well, even against Grixis that are playing Flesh Gorger. It's so brutal for them to deal with a 2/1 against Grixis, for them to deal with a 2/1 that just destroyed one of their creatures, or potentially answering like a half a Fable. Obviously, that's a little less good, but still, Loran is just insane in this metagame, and a lot of people are really pushing it in standard decks. All right, we have that. I just talked about Brotherhood's End a little earlier, but that's a problem for the front side of well, not I don't know if you should call it the front side, but the prototype side of Steel Seraph. It's not really a side, but the prototype cast of Steel Seraph. This is a problem. Another problem is this card right here, Farewell. So Farewell, potentially only naming artifacts and enchantments could hit you really, really hard in certain board states where they have a bigger board than you do, and they're looking to eliminate a few key creatures to get in for the final months of damage. So this is mostly against Mono White or the mirror match, for example. This could also matter. It's a little less relevant, but it does matter, I think. Now, another problem with Steel Seraph is that since I mentioned earlier that you don't really want to play it on 3, depending on your deck's build, the problem is, as a 6-drop, it is still very vulnerable because it has no self-protection. It's not a card that replaces itself. It's simply a lot of stats, a lot of damage, and additional effects on your other creatures. So it represents a lot of essentially damage. And, well, at least anything that has to do with the health total, because lifelink can create that, health discrepancy, and then you can pull really far ahead. But that's essentially it. If this gets answered, that's it. It's gone. So this is kind of a problem in this metagame. As I mentioned with Loran, there's a lot of card advantage in this format and a lot of good removal. And usually it's difficult to reach for your opponent when decks are very sturdy against damage from creatures. There's a lot of removal. There's a lot of life gain in the format, I would say. Like a lot of people playing Shieldred, if you're playing against Archangel Wrath decks, if you're playing against mono white, they have like Wandering Emperor and stuff like that. I'm trying to think if they have other ways to gain life. Yeah, they could also have the farmer that can transform into a lifelinker. There's I feel like there's another way for them to gain life that I'm not thinking of. But either way, there's the Sarah Paragon that could bring back stuff, and then if you kill it, blah blah blah. But that's a little convoluted. I don't know. Oh, they also have Steel Seraphs. Okay, either way, that wasn't my point. I don't know why I went on that tangent, but yeah, essentially, there's a lot of good removal, and it's kind of hard to die from creatures alone in this format. So that's kind of a problem when you pair it up against creatures that are also doing a ton of damage, but also are very resistant to removal spells. So cards like Owl, cards like Sanctuary Warden. So assuming you're not playing it for 3 mana, then in most cases you would probably be better off playing another copy of Sanctuary Warden or playing another Owl. Because if you compare Steel Seraph to Owl, for example, you get a 5/4 Vigilance Flyer, which is essentially what this card can do for 6, although you get the flexibility of giving something else flying, or giving it, let's say itself. You can give itself, you can give it Vigilance, Lifelink, and Flying. But if you give Vigilance, the same thing as Owl. But they cannot destroy Owl without repercussions, but they can destroy Steel Seraph with no repercussion. So that's kind of a problem. Especially Grixis. Grixis has a lot of removal and a lot of card draw. So when you consider on 6 playing a Sanctuary Warden or Seraph, usually you're almost always going to want the Sanctuary Warden because you get the extra card and you get the natural protection from the 1 shield counter. Now, against Mono White, that's the same scenario. Against Mono White, they have a lot of good removal. For 6, when you cast this for 6, especially Destroy Evil becomes available. And then they have the Lay Down Arms or whatever that card is called. And they have a bunch of sweepers. All of this is kind of annoying for your Steel Seraph. Now, it does dodge Wandering Emperor, which is main upside against Mono White. But again, getting that card from Sanctuary Warden, and very importantly, getting a multicolored Citizen, which does draw you a card off of Depopulate as well. So that's the problem, is that this card has flexibility, but its flexibility is not that good, because for 3, the cards it's competing with are usually better, and for 6, it's simply a good card. But again, even cards like Shieldred, I feel like are falling off a little bit in this metagame. Like I was only playing Shieldred because I was trying to like really leverage the amount of damage this deck can do with the Steel Seraph on 5 potentially giving Shieldred flying. It's not really working out. I feel like creatures that don't have an enter the battlefield effect that result in some form of card advantage are very quickly losing their place in current standard with the amount of with the amount of value that decks currently have, like mono white control. It seems like they can just outvalue this. They don't even care about the damage it's dealing. They just kill it, and it's a 1-for-1. But it's more efficient for them because their removal spells cost way less than Shieldred. So you're tapping out, they're killing it for like 1 or 2. They're developing something. It's in the end, it's a losing battle because they have sweepers, and against Grixis, they have a ton of card advantage. They can really punish if you don't go wide. They have counter spells too, so tapping. I mean, that's not relevant, but because counter spells will counter anything in this deck. But I don't know. You get my point is that they can kill this and then also develop something, while you can just play this and probably you're gonna pass turn. So they kill it and they play like an appraiser. They draw an extra card. It's just not good. I think that's gonna do it for this little talk about Steel Seraph. I'm pretty sure I got everything that I wanted to get out of the way. Now, I guess I didn't go into its best position in the meta as a creature. I think this card is best suited for a deck that has many 2-drops, or maybe a deck with like 2 or 3 Bankbusters, and then I would say you would probably need 12 2-drops. Either way, Bankbuster is ideal because you can crew it and then give it flying or give it lifelink, and that's a huge swing. So I think with 12 2-drops, then it actually becomes a creature worth considering for 3 mana. The problem with most decks is that they simply want to play less 2-drops because the other cards that are more expensive are simply just too good. If you look at this deck, for example, card like Fable, you can't really cut these. They're too powerful. Fable, Wedding Announcement, you want to play these no matter over 2-drop 100%. Archangel Wrath, cards like Shield Red, even Edgar. Like all of the 2-drops are just not that good in a metagame that can slow down the pace. For mono white, it's a lot of controlling elements and sweepers, and for Grixis, it's very efficient removal and very efficient like counter spells and stuff like that. So you don't want to lean too far into 2-drops as an aggro deck. It's just not viable in this metagame. It's too efficient to come back on board in the mid game. So you need cards that are slower and generate more value, which is why Steel Seraph is a little bit awkward, I think, overall. It's because you can't leverage its ability to deal that much damage early, since you don't have the 2-drops, the 2-drop counts, in my opinion, to leverage that. So you're mostly using it as a flex 3-drop if you don't have another 3-drop, or you're using it as a 6-drop, which is fine in some cases where it doesn't die. It's actually very good, but what are the odds that it doesn't die? I think that's the thing you have to solve is, will my Steel Seraph live on average? Or will it just stick on the board because I have enough threats to bait out removal, which is kind of my thought process for this specific build of the deck. Now, I guess I should also mention whether or not you should be playing Steel Seraph according to my experience in this deck specifically. So any version of Mardu Angels, let's say. I actually would say it's probably not worth playing. Now, in the end, after going through all those points, the main contention for me is Loran, and I think it's a big point of contention. So far, so that I am cutting Steel Seraph pretty much every time post board against all white decks, and even against Grixis, I am still cutting it, since against Grixis, you really need that card advantage, and this does not give you access to that. So essentially, I'm simply playing Steel Seraph for game 1, or for creature matchups that are already in my favor. I think the best version of Mardu mid-range, let's call it now, because it's less angels. I think the best version of Mardu mid-range now is one without Steel Seraph, and one that leans further into card advantage, using Bankbusters and Underdog, and less on the more creature-centric game plan that I think is losing a lot of steam in this current metagame, with mono white really popping up a lot more in standard than would be ideal for such a creature deck with Giada, for example. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this relatively long ramble. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye.